Hi everyone, welcome to the show. We're back into a new year, and of course, some things around here are new as well. For instance, I have this new background behind me. It's a nice view, isn't it? It is nice. Now, if you're not familiar with how my show works, and you're very much new to it, very basically, we cover complex issues that deserve a lot of attention. Usually these are issues that get a lot of attention recently, or issues that don't get a lot of attention, but very much deserve to be in the spotlight. And don't feel bad if my jokes don't come with an audience laughing at them. I'm unusually comfortable doing comedy in dead silence. So, with that in mind, the subject of my story this week concerns death. One of the many natural parts of life that you simply cannot avoid, along with paying your taxes and falling in love to some degree with Zendaya and or Haley Steinfeld. Statistically, it's hard not to. Now specifically, we're going to talk about what happens after you die, which is your friends and loved ones organize and hold your funeral. A funeral is a part of the grieving process when losing a friend or a loved one, and we've seen a massive increase in those since the pandemic hit. The main problem people have figured out about funerals is that arranging one can be expensive, and recently, the price for arranging a funeral has been getting higher and has made a surprisingly profitable industry.
No fewer than 2 million people die in the United States each year, and that makes dealing with our dead a $20 billion industry.
The average cost of a funeral has been rising at twice the rate of inflation since the 1980s.
In 2019, the median cost of a traditional adult funeral with viewing, burial, and vault was $9,135.
That's right, it costs around $9,000 just to bury your loved one, which is incredibly ridiculous. That's roughly the cost of 75 years worth of subscription payments to Netflix, or 4 55-inch Samsung 4K smart TV sets, or this century-old bonsai tree sold at a department store in Tokyo. Now you would expect burying your dead loved one to be expensive, but you do not expect it to be as expensive as a Twisted Cheetos Puffs tree that got hit with Rick Moranis' shrink ray. But it is true that funeral services can be expensive. In that CNBC graphic you saw earlier, the price of a casket alone could be around $2,500, and there are several examples of caskets having sky-high prices, like in these caskets sold on Costco's actual website for more than $1,000 per casket, and that's not including the cost for shipping and handling. Then, there's the fact that being demonstrated on comedy shows like the since-canceled Comedy Central series The Jeff Dunham Show, where Ahmed, the dead terrorist, is throwing himself a funeral to celebrate his 7th death day, and he sees one casket worth $8,000 and gets a pet casket worth just $50, which is weird, since a casket potentially having Wi-Fi, and the fact that the only casket, a talking skeleton with a luxury resort towel on his head, getting a paw print coated casket for the same price as a dinner for two at Olive Garden. And what exactly would a dead body watch on a TV screen when lying dead? The Disney Zombies franchise? The music video for Thriller on a continuous loop? I don't know. I don't know any dead people, so I don't know what they like. And everyone else doesn't seem to know what they like, because, and this is true, nobody knows a dead person. It's kind of hard to know a dead person. After all, they're known to be antisocial. But what makes this industry so frustrating to have to deal with is that they have a tendency to profit off people when they are at their most vulnerable. Well, just listen to this one guy tell 60 Minutes how funeral homes can push people into spending more on funeral expenses.
Abuses, financial exploitation, misrepresentations of legal requirements, pressuring emotionally vulnerable people into believing that the more they spend, the more love and respect that they're showing for somebody.
Yeah, and that can be an effective way to tell someone that it's the best way to show their dead loved one that they care so much. But it kind of defeats the real message they would like to convey, which is you shouldn't have to break your bank or budget to show someone how much you love them. It's about as stupid as going on a first date, and instead of getting her a single rose to show her you've been thinking about her, you get her a wedding cake. And the price for a funeral can be so expensive that you may have heard people resorting often to crowdfunding campaigns to cover funeral costs. According to GoFundMe's data, 13% of crowdfunding campaigns on their site funded memorials, and one study found that 17% of the younger generations of adults either solicited or donated money to funeral-related fundraising campaigns. And even when people do have the financial means to pay for funerals of family members or friends, they can either do it as normally as possible, or if you're this family in an episode of the TLC show Best Funeral Ever, you throw a funeral that's quite, depending on how you look at it, either very unconventional or very, very weird.
Lord, we want to thank you for the food we're about to receive. Thank the Lord for giving us a good meal.
Quentin loved breakfast, so the family decided to celebrate his life with a breakfast funeral.
That's right, they threw a funeral for a family member with a breakfast food theme, which I assume was arranged and conducted by IHOP, the International House of Pallbearers. Also, I don't know what religion is being expressed there, but I want to convert to it immediately. I want a church that will serve me chocolate chip pancakes whenever I ask them to, whenever I get there on a Sunday. Eat your damn heart out, Cracker Barrel, because you could literally never serve me such pancake-focused breakfast deliciousness. So to recap, we have an industry of death getting more unaffordable to the point where the only affordable option for burial is a casket only fit for a pet cemetery, people throwing weirdly themed funerals to honor someone's life when they can't afford it, an industry that has a tendency to break the banks of families when they're in their time of need. So this week, let's talk about the funeral home industry, why funerals can be so expensive and what's driving the costs up, what kind of practices the funeral home industry engages in, and what we can do to lower the price tag of putting our loved ones to rest. And let's start with the fact that there's actually two major ways to bury your loved one. There's the ordinary burial, where you bury your loved one in a cemetery or a mausoleum, and then there's cremation. We're mostly going to focus on the former because it's often seen as the traditional method. And the way that process works is like this. After you die, your body is preserved by the funeral home and is then touched up for display in a casket, and the funeral is conducted and the body is then laid to rest in a cemetery. And the first step to do that is actually where the cost is not much on the person paying for it, but the people doing the preservation, which I'll get to in a minute. The process where the person's dead body is preserved is known as embalming, where your corpse is pumped full of preservative chemicals to ensure that body doesn't decompose after death. This process is only popular in the funeral process in the US and Canada and seen by the rest of the world as inherently weird, unless of course you're a famous communist leader, in which case it's all the rage for those who are on the brink of death. But embalming had been around for ages, but became popularized in the 1860s after President Lincoln's assassination. His body was perfectly preserved so that he could be put on display for mourners as his corpse was moved by train all the way to his burial tomb in Illinois, which is very interesting because if there's one thing everyone wants to see a famous dead person do, it's go on a national tour. Now, after Lincoln's funeral procession, embalming eventually became a funeral home industry standard, and they work hard to ensure that people still do it, not because they want to see your deceased relative look great in death, but more like as a means to fill their bottom line. That guy you saw earlier from 60 Minutes, just listen to him describe how the funeral industry uses embalming to make themselves wealthier.
There's a phrase in the funeral industry, embalming is the cornerstone of our profession. What does that mean? It means that if you can convince people that an embalmed, beautified body is a good thing, you can convince them to pay for it. You can likely convince them to purchase or rent a suitably costly casket in which to display it. It's about a culture and an ethical code to emphasize a very profitable way of dealing with grieving families.
That is just very surprising because what he essentially said there was embalming is often a means to not preserve a cultural tradition in burying the dead and more like a way to help them make money, which is why you often see them offer embalming or embalming with a side of sweet potato fries. Now, the funeral industry likes to paint the process of embalming as a way to bring peace of mind to those who are grieving and preserve the body. But it's worth noting that the science in embalming shows that the process actually delays decomposition of the corpse, not stop it. It's sort of like putting imported cheese in your fridge. It's still gonna make your dairy drawer smell like pasteurized shit, but the process of it going bad is only going to be delayed. And to get families that are mourning to go along with it, the industry has a tendency to practice scare tactics to get them to open their wallets, with tricks like falsely claiming that not preserving the body through embalming is illegal, to falsely claiming that it stops the spread of disease. And it turns out the latter is actually more untrue when you find out that there's more health risk involved in those preserving the body. You see, One of the chemicals used to preserve the body is formaldehyde, the chemical you expect to be used to preserve bodies of frogs or even pigs in school biology classes that are used for dissection labs. And according to the National Toxicology Program, formaldehyde has been found to be a human carcinogen, meaning that it could cause serious health risks like various forms of cancer, like cancer in the nasopharynx, and even leukemia. And the CDC has even called it a systemic poison. It's so bad that leads to 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluids being buried out in the ground per year. So we basically wind up getting buried the same way we live, by destroying ourselves and everything within eye distance of all of us. And of course, the funeral business is of course a business, and they mostly care about their bottom line. But it wasn't always a business, as this woman puts in a surprisingly calm manner.
The real American funeral was basically families taking care of their own at home. The person died, there would be a wake in the home. They'd be either carried to the church or to the church cemetery, back to the home for a home burial. It was pretty simple.
Yeah, pretty simple. Unless, of course, you're in a situation where moving the body is akin to Rachel and Ross moving a couch across a flight of stairs. It's just as easy as you might think it is. Now, death didn't become professionalized until the 1930s, when people were dying in hospitals as opposed to their own homes. Today, for those in a fixed income or living in poverty, paying for a funeral can be impossible. Remember, the cost of a casket on average is around $2,500, and even renting a casket can come close to the same price, as this undercover video shows of someone who planned to rent a casket to display one of their relatives in, but have them cremated rather than buried.
Another questionable cost? Rental caskets. To view Aunt Alice, who, remember, will be cremated.
I was more suggesting, from an economical standpoint, a rental casket. To rent it, it's $2,250 for one day.
It costs $2,200 to rent the casket for just one day. One day it costs $2,200 to have someone displayed in a casket, but not buried in it. That's roughly the same cost as going to Starbucks every day for a year. It's not entirely expected that rental could cost you an arm and a leg when you already have an entire dead body. Now the problem is, none of these families know how much a funeral truly costs until they get the bill. The Federal Trade Commission has rules in place requiring funeral homes to give a detailed list of prices to anyone requesting one. Unfortunately, they're not required to post the prices on the funeral home's website. That is simply absurd. There's gotta be a better system paying for a funeral than going to funeral home service shopping and having the price on their website be captioned with whatever number we're currently thinking of. There's also the potential for funeral homes with a history of unethical practices, which can range from improperly performing embalming procedures, mixing up bodies, or even incorrectly storing corpses, like this one funeral home did in suburban Las Vegas.
Babies being stacked on top of each other, my heart dropped.
Rayvon Thomas said enough was enough.
I always said, like, what if families came in here and saw what you were doing with their loved ones?
Thomas says he's worked in the funeral business for 5 years, a year and a half at Heights, and was fired in July.
I called the labor board and I called the funeral board. I even called the Clark County Coroner's office and got you guys put off rotation. And when I told him that, it was over.
Thomas claims he was let go for threatening to report problems. He shared videos and photos with me, he says, are from Heights, most too graphic to share.
You'll have another picture where the bio waste bags are not in the bio bins.
One video shows what he says is embalming happening in the wrong area. Another shows someone sawing a metal shelf with sparks flying on bodies stacked below. Another shows what he says are babies stacked on a shelf. The law says that human remains must not be placed on other human remains.
You'll see that there's at least 5 or 6 babies stacked on top of each other.
Okay, that is just purely upsetting, especially the storing of dead babies, because that is just no way to properly store dead bodies. They're not dead bodies in video games that just disappear when you go around the street corner. These are people whose loved ones who shouldn't be subjected to the standard of care dead bodies get in a Grand Theft Auto game. Now, you should know, the state of Nevada has since suspended that funeral home's license, which is good, because the last thing you want is to have funeral services provided to you by a funeral home that behaves unethically. But the problem with the funeral industry can go well beyond unethical stacking of bodies. Over the years, the funeral home industry has lobbied state governments hard to enact laws where the funeral homes benefit the most. Currently, state laws on conducting funeral preparations, like preserving the body, vary, and not one state requires a person to be buried in a casket or coffin, which is genuinely ridiculous because last time I checked, we're not burying people in wooden caskets like the Wild West. Now, if any of those risks seem like something that might not fit your idea of burying your loved one, you may want to try the more affordable option, which is cremation, where the body is burned and the ashes are either kept in an urn, scattered out across an area, or even made into memorable items like diamonds. But you should know, even this method has its problems, particularly when it comes to the environment. Cremation tends to lead to some deadly toxins getting released into the air, which can cause cremation to have a more serious carbon footprint than just simply burying them, despite being marketed as a more environmentally friendly way to give your relatives a proper send-off. Now, cremation can be regulated though, as some communities impose limits of how many hours a crematory can operate without harming the local air quality. And there are thankfully some greener forms of cremation, like water cremation, also known as alkaline hydrolysis, and this is how it works.
Body goes into a purpose-built unit. Water, heat, sodium, and potassium are used to break down its proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. The leftover bones can be fragmented and put into an urn. The effluent put down the drain. Aquamation simply dissolves the body.
Right. The process works by using mostly water to reduce the body to components of liquid and human bone. And what happens after that is that the bone fragments left over are retained so that they can be dried up and turned to a substance similar to ashes from an ordinary cremation. It's probably more environmentally friendly than any Jedi Knight funeral. Now, as for ordinary cremation, while it may seem like an affordable option, it still doesn't come cheap, as the cost of a cremation can be somewhere between $2,000 to $2,500 to even $5,000, depending on which city and state you live in, and how much the funeral home charges you, not to mention the cost for an urn to put the remains in. And when you do get an urn, there are a lot of interesting designs to choose from, like this vase-style urn that could have your name on it and your epitaph, or one of these urns containing either a statue of a muscle car or a motorcycle on top, or even this one in the shape of a camper, which I can only assume is a metaphor for someone's life being an incredibly bumpy ride, in which case, nailed it, no notes. Now, there are environmental factors here to consider, as when bodies are cremated, a lot of toxic pollutants can be released into the air, where people nearby could one way or another breathe in. And people not just complain about the process producing pollutants, but the smell of the smoke that crematoriums emit, like this one in Fort Myers.
No, it's disgusting.
People living at Sundance Grove say this smoky situation is cause for concern.
We can smell an odor.
David Denny inviting me over to see firsthand what's going on here. I didn't see smoke today, but the crematorium's back door is open. People living here say they can see everything going on inside, and they don't like it.
You know, being the business that it is, they ought to have a little bit more dignity to it, you know, and have things closed.
Denny says it gets so smoky, sometimes it's hard to tell where it's coming from.
My wife thought the building was on fire last night, you know, when we pulled in.
Yeah, that's not great, is it? Because the last thing you want to have is smoke of someone's dead body coming towards your front door and you breathing it in. It's probably the reason why the Ewok cited Luke Skywalker for not following cremation regulations. And when you could afford a funeral or to cremate someone, even the process of getting a death certificate can be a real headache, because ideally, you would expect the certificate of death to be sent to you within days. The problem is, it can take much longer than that. As this woman tells you, the time it takes to get a death certificate can be very slow.
They're not thinking of these families that are waiting in agony, waiting to know what happened to their loved ones. It's inexcusable.
The holdup also left Sarah struggling financially because without the death certificate, she couldn't collect life insurance to take care of her family.
I couldn't pay for the mortgage. I had to rely on donations from friends and family.
To you, it's much more than just a piece of paper.
Yes, to me, it meant moving on.
That's awful. No one should have to wait that long for a death certificate. They should only have to wait that long to see if Pixar would make another sequel for any one of its movies from the 2000s. It shouldn't take that long to make one sequel. And when you put all of this together, the heavy expenses, the pollution from burning bodies, and the predatory behavior of the funeral industry, you wind up with a situation worse than simply losing a loved one and to the angels of death. So what can be done about this? Well, One way to solve this problem is by rethinking the way we bury our dead, and there are better alternatives to spending thousands of dollars to put your loved one in a 6-foot deep hole. For instance, you can bury a loved one through what's called a green burial, where the use of biodegradable materials are involved and can cost half as much as the price of embalming. There's also the possibility of having your body composted, and instead of using a headstone, some resort to planting trees, where someone is buried rather than pay thousands of dollars for the headstone. Now, many of these problems exist due to the fact that we ourselves are afraid to face our own deaths. But death is a natural part of life, and it can be scary to contemplate what happens when we die and what happens after that. But until these problems with the funeral industry are fixed, we may have to continue to deal with the industry's predatory behavior, a long-held desire to stick to traditions, and potentially hold a funeral for ourselves where the theme is every hotel's continental breakfast. That's our show. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Good night.